Broadcasting. Give me a minute. I need to go see if I can get things happening live at Rockfin. There we go. We're live at Rockfin, and I believe we're also live at Rumble. Now I'm doing a little live programming here, and I would like to invite callers. I can take calls, just like a regular radio station. Let me just make sure my Skype number is up and functioning before I make that promise. They want me to update terms. Oh, brother. Yeah, there we go. 508 928 5255 is the number. 508 928 5255. You're welcome to join the program. Rumble is a little bit behind, but so be it. Looks like, there we go. Excellent. I want to obviously discuss the situation in Israel right now. What has happened with Hamas paragliding into a rock concert and murdering as many people as they could is, while it's unprecedented, it's not new. This is something that's been going on in Israel really for over a century. It goes back to the 19th century, where Jews are attacked like that, excuse me, by Muslims. I'm sorry to phrase it in those terms, but I think we need to acknowledge that at least that is an element of what's going on. We need to understand the nature of what's going on without making any apologies in order to get to a solution. I don't think there is a solution in the broad sense to this kind of clash, this kind of hatred. What Huntington called the clash of civilizations in his work. But I think we need to come to some clarity, and I think we need to talk about what we as Jews intend to do about it. And what I'm seeing out there right now, and what I've been told right now by people who are out in the field, so to speak. I just heard from someone, a very close relative of mine in New York, who had attended certain rallies, including one at the United Nations yesterday and one in Brooklyn the day before. And I've heard from other sources and from what I've read that a Jewish reaction to this terror, and I understand where they're coming from. I get it. It is ugly and it is horrifying, and it grabs you emotionally, and it's depressing. But the reaction is, we're going to kill Arabs. We're going to wipe them out, and that they're animals. And what I can tell you is that that is not consistent with Jewish values. In the face of this sort of atrocity, we need to keep a cooler head. We cannot allow ourselves to be drawn into the trap that they have created for us. They're releasing propaganda pictures. Those are real pictures. That's not made up. They're releasing for the purpose of propaganda, in order to inflame us, in order to rile us up, and to get us to then respond by doing things that are stupid and that are not in our interests. This is part of any war. In World War I, the Kaiser of Germany created postcards with dead Americans on them, including the son of Theodore Roosevelt. They showed his body mutilated. Roosevelt saw that picture, and it sent him to his grave. He became so angry and so depressed. It made him rethink some of his rather warlike positions previously in life. But the point is that they did this to weaken the will of their enemies. And in this case, their enemy is Israel by their perception. Israel is not their enemy in reality, but we're talking about two different categories here. The category of reality and the category of perception. And in their category of perception, Israel is their enemy for one reason and one reason only. And that is because Israel has the temerity, has the arrogance, has the nerve to be a Jewish state made up of a majority of Jews who are living their lives openly as Jews, who are identifying themselves as Jews, and who are determining their own destinies as individuals and as a society, as in Jewish individuals and as a Jewish society. This is too much. This is too much for the Islamists. They take it personally. It's like an insult to them. And the fact that Israel in 1967 was able to take over Jerusalem and the Jewish holy sites, that added to their rage. Not that it wasn't there all along, and not that they weren't acting out on it all along. Thus, this is a religious question. Yes, it's also a political question and a social question, but I want to address the religious side of it. And that is that the Muslim is commanded to destroy Jews. The Muslim is believing of himself to be in an eternal war against the Jews, because the Muslims believe that the Jews are in rebellion against God in a way that is similar to Christianity. I'm going to get into that in a minute. But with regard to the Muslim conception, this goes back to the Quran and to the Hadith, the early Islamic traditions, when the Prophet Muhammad was operating in Medina, had not yet, I don't think he had yet occupied Mecca. Or maybe he had, I don't know the exact chronology. But he confronted the city of Khaybar, or the neighborhood of Khaybar. It was a neighborhood of Mecca, a neighborhood that was predominantly Jewish. It consisted of a Jewish tribe, the Quraysh tribe. Had been Jewish probably for centuries. It was a prosperous neighborhood. It was looked like a lot of prosperous Jewish neighborhoods in the United States and in my own Massachusetts, right? Made up of people who were propertied, people who were learned, people who were talented, people who were contributors to the society. And he asked them if they would join his religion, basically. Would they accept him as the final prophet? Would they conform to him as a miraculous figure? Now, I'm not going to get into a talk here about theology, whether or not Muhammad is the last prophet. Those are Islamic questions. I'm leaving that up to Muslims to talk about, not me. I'm an outsider. I am not a Muslim. But what I can tell you is that according to their doctrines and according to their writings, the Jewish community of Khaybar, with trepidation and fear, they declined the offer to accept Muhammad as the prophet. They did not recognize Muhammad's claims to divinity. Now, Muhammad is not like Jesus. He wasn't claiming to be the Son of God or Messiah or any of that. But he was making these claims to have direct communication with Allah or God or Elohim. The reaction on the part of Muhammad and his followers to that non-acceptance on the part of the Jewish community of Khaybar, the Quraysh community, was genocide. There's no way to, and it's very, very specifically delineated in either the Quran or the Hadith. It was really a situation where the entire community was rounded up. The numbers were recorded. Every single person was put to death in the most cruel and depraved way. The property was all divided up. They were completely and utterly annihilated because of this refusal. Now, some of the Hamas radicals who are involved in this kind of depravity now, where they have kidnapped Jews who are attending that conference, they are holding them hostage, where they tortured and raped and chopped up young Jewish boys and girls attending a music conference. Now, they could have been like at a Rolling Stone conference here at the Boston TGB Center. You know, it's like these were people who are out having a nice time. It is similar to the way the Jews of Khaybar were handled, and they were chanting Khaybar Yuf, which I think means the Khaybar Jews. That was along with their chanting Allah Akbar. This is their idea of God as the greatest. They're doing it for God, they believe. And what I would say to that is that this idea of annihilating the Jewish people as a way to defeat the enemies of God, as they perceive that, and thus purify the world and create this march toward a utopia, a world order. And Islam is very political and military. It's not just, it's not like in the Western conception. I know that some people don't like the term, but the Judeo-Christian perception, which is that, in the case of the Jews, we believe we have a special covenant with God that was made at Sinai. In the case of the Christians, they believe that they have a covenant. They continue that covenant, and they have another covenant with Jesus as the intercessor and as the Son of God. Basically, if you go to God through the Son, then you're saved, and that you can be redeemed, and you can have salvation, and all the rest. But neither of those two conceptions call for the physical, literal, military conquest of the planet. Both of those conceptions are basically voluntary, not to say that there haven't been instances where force was used, but those are exceptions, and those deviate from the doctrine in the case of Christianity and the understanding in the case of Judaism, because we don't have doctrines. Those were conceptions that involved a personal commitment to the covenant of God and the children of Israel at Sinai in the case of the Jews. In the case of Christians, it is a personal, voluntary commitment to and relationship with Jesus as the Son of God and as the intercessor with God. And I think in the case of Catholicism, that also includes Mary. But it's a personal and it's a voluntary relationship. It is one that the individual arrives at on their own because they conclude that it is the way and the light and the truth. And that is true regarding both of our faiths, Judaism and Christianity. Islam has that element as well. However, Muhammad was a general. He carried the sword, and he led armies in conquest. By the end of his life, his movement had conquered most of the Arabian Peninsula. They intended to create a physical world government under their control in order to create this utopian paradise. There had to be one government in the world to reflect the one God in heaven, Allah. In order to do that, they would have to physically defeat all of the nations that resisted that government. Pagan nations, Christian nations, all nations ultimately would have to fall to the scimitar. They would all have to become part of the caliphate. The Jews were singled out for special condemnation because of the rejection at Khaybar, in that they were seen as the enemies of God that would ultimately and eternally have to be eliminated. Now, look, I'm going to briefly get into a quick rabbit hole here and talk about the similar doctrines that have been at the core of Christianity. The Jews are the enemies of God. There are, like Dr. E. Michael Jones likes to say, the enemies of Logos. I don't know if he created that idea or if that's conventional Christian conception, but nevertheless, there is that quote that he keeps mentioning in the beginning of the Gospel of John, where he says, God created Logos, the Word, and the Word was good, and the Word was God. And he equates that, and probably accurately from a traditional Christian standpoint, with the idea that Jesus represents the Logos incarnate, that in the person made in flesh. And that since the Jews rejected Jesus as the Messiah, they therefore rejected God, and they are therefore at war with God. And thus they have to not be eliminated, but they have to be controlled. Christianity rejected the genocidal impulse when St. Augustine of Hippo developed a formula by which the Jews would be allowed to live. St. Augustine of Hippo came around the time of the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. His contemporaries and various Christian leaders before him, and up until that point, were advocating genocide against the Jews. St. Athanasius, St. John Chrysostom, some of these people are quoted in E. Michael Jones's book, the Jewish Revolutionary Spirit, which is, by the way, I'm deriving information for my own book, which should be out hopefully toward the end of this year, called The Anti-Semitic Spirit. But putting that aside, there was a movement at that time, and there were sentiments being expressed at that time by very powerful and influential Christian leaders. St. Jerome, there were a lot of quotes I could draw from here, calling for the abolition and the extinction of the Jewish people. Well, St. Augustine stepped into that, and he said that the Jewish people are the people of the book. We are observing what Christians call the Old Testament, the prophets, the Torah, the Tanakh. And because of that, and because we believed in God and do believe in God, we should not be annihilated. We should be allowed to continue. He said we should not be harmed, and we should be allowed to worship unmolested in our houses of worship, our synagogues. However, there was a codicil to that, in that because we remain the enemies of God, because we were blind, he felt, because we didn't understand it, we were deficient, and because we thus were the enemies of Logos, the Jews would not be allowed to hold positions of public influence. They would be restricted in what they could do and not do. They would have dhimmi status, is the way it's expressed in the Islamic world. We would be second-class citizens. We would be treated the way black people in America were treated in the Jim Crow era. Not quite as bad as the slavery era. We weren't to be enslaved, but we were to be restricted. We were not to have the same rights, and we were to be looked upon with scorn. Once in a while, we could be slapped around if we stepped out of line. Interpretations of how that would translate. I think it's safe to say that in Christian history, from that point forward, Jews would be exiled from different countries and their property would be looted. in what I would contend was a looting operation. But nevertheless, we would be restricted. It developed a very interesting and somewhat covalent and cooperative relationship between select Jews and Christian princes. I get into this in my book. It's another subject for another day. I'm only bringing it up now to note that with regard to the Jews, Christianity is not as extreme. And what I would say to Christians, by the way, on this doctrine, this idea that the Jews killed God and that thus we are, enemies of God, while I personally reject that completely, I'm not going to meddle in Christian affairs. If this is what Christians believe, then that's their business. I don't think that they've believed these things monolithically. I think there's been always debate and there's always been nuance around it. But nevertheless, those are Christian arguments. And what I would say to Christians is that as long as we are in this great secular American republic, you can believe whatever you want, but you should not and cannot interfere with my rights as an American citizen to enjoy all of the benefits and all of the blessings that citizenship provides. That you have no right to impose that view on me or any of your views. I respect your right to believe what you believe. I respect your right to practice what you believe in the context of your own faith. You do not have the right to interfere in my faith, and as a Jew, I reject that notion. Furthermore, I'm going to just say one more thing about this before moving on. The Christians believe that the Jews are responsible for authorizing the killing of Jesus. Really, the Romans obviously executed Jesus. Judea had lost all semblance of sovereignty at that point. The Romans were the authorities. And thus we killed God. What I would say to that is that, first of all, the Sanhedrin and the majority of Jewish people at that time, even if they heard of Jesus, to the degree that they had, they did not believe that he was God. It's just that simple. That's history. They believed that, and if you take away the idea that he was God, regardless of the fact that he was a devout Jew and that he was actually responsible for ultimately for his ministry, bringing forth the Jewish moral and ethical precepts of the Torah to much of mankind, which is why Jesus, as a person, was, I would suggest, the most important person ever to live. Nevertheless, if he was not God, as they believed at that time, that would make him a heretic. That would make him a disturber of the moral order at that time, or, if you will, of the Logos. And as such, in the conventional understanding of those times, he had engaged in activity that was seditious and that could be viewed in the context of worthy of the death penalty, and that the death penalty in those days was meted out to heretics. So that's what basically happened. Christianity, of course, continued with that particular approach to heretics that they believed had defied their Logos. And in that regard, I would note that the Roman Catholic Church would put to death by burning at the stake Jan Hus, the Bohemian Hussite rebellion against Catholicism that occurred in Bohemia in the 14th century. He was burned at the stake along with 250 of his followers. That's the same idea. That was the same justification that was used for that the Jews who in their day who supported the execution of Jesus. It doesn't make it right. I don't think in retrospect it was right. They shouldn't have done it. They should have maybe exiled him. Although, not to get into a subject, had they not done it, had they let Jesus just live on and continue with his ministry, if he wasn't the Messiah, he would have been forgotten. There wouldn't have been, even if he was the Messiah, Isn't a basic part of Christianity this idea that he died for your sins and that he was the last sacrifice, the Agnus Dei, the sacrificial lamb, and that through his blood and through his sacrifice, one can be saved? I mean, where would that be if they hadn't advocated? But that's another subject, and again, I'm not going to intervene on that, even though I suppose I just did. But the problem with Islam is that they didn't have St. Augustine. They didn't have canon law that might regulate these impulses. And of course, in 1920s, Kemal Ataturk, the the young Turk, the head of the Turkish Republic, abolished the Islamic Caliphate and exiled the Caliph, who basically fled to England, where he lived the rest of his life. And I think that was a big mistake because the Caliph he wasn't the equivalent of a pope, but I think he did exercise religious authority in Islamic circles, and he very well may have been more moderate, and his moderation very well may have been respected. Of course, we can't know that. Maybe he would have been more radical. I don't know. Maybe he would have called for complete jihad. I don't know. We don't know. But I think that a central religious authority can play a significant and important and good role in terms generally of modifying and not redefining, but shaping religions to be suitable to the times in which they exist. So anyway, here we are with Jews overreacting. I'm sorry, but I see it. They're calling for the death of Arabs. They're calling for the complete destruction of Hamas, which, by the way, I support that. But just the unnecessarily violent destruction of Muslims, and that's wrong. Not only does it defy Jewish values, but it's bad for the Jews. It's not going to be helpful for Israel. They can't do that. It's not going to work. All it's going to do is stir up more trouble. I think that I heard a very interesting on with Michael Savage, who is doing a great podcast right now. He's been around for a long time as a talk show host. He's an award-winning radio personality. He's great. He's one of these great former New York, Brooklyn liberal who became conservative as he got older, and then he's out in San Francisco. And he just has a lot of insights. Good guy. Well, he had on this former CIA analyst, who I've heard around, I forget his name, Johnson? I've seen his also, he's been published in the Gateway Pundit, which I read. And I thought that he had a very interesting insight. He pointed out that as things stand right now in Israel, the Gaza is holding up to 100 hostages, maybe more. We don't know their condition, but the demands generally are that Israel release something like 5,000 Muslim Arab prisoners. He suggested that Israel do this. They take back all of the hostages and they release the 5,000 prisoners in an exchange. That they cool things down a little bit, maybe for a week or so, and then they send the message to Gaza that they are coming, that they're going to take out the Hamas government, and that people, if they want safety, had better get the hell out of there. Now, by the way, where can they go if Israel's blockading and Egypt is blockading the border as well? I don't know where they can go. That's a very difficult question. Maybe Israel could open a portion of the border and let them come into the Negev, and they can be not concentration camps, God forbid, refugee camps. Was that a Freudian slip? Some people, oh yes, no. I'm telling you, Rome did this with Carthage. They notified the people of Carthage that they were going to be destroying the city, and that they could move 50 miles outside the city and create a new city. That's what I think has to be done here. And so you need to open that portion of the border, have a means by which these people can be processed and screened, and then settle briefly in these refugee camps until a permanent home can be found for them. And then they need to go into Gaza and end the sovereignty for Hamas. They cannot be trusted at this point. They've already proven time and again that they will turn Gaza into a launching pad to destroy Israel, and they've done it many times. And thus, Israel can't tolerate that as a sovereign state. They cannot have that going on their border. They have to neutralize it, and the only way to do that is to completely destroy and crush the Hamas infrastructure, completely and utterly, just like the Romans did to Carthage. So that's what I have to say about it. Check out my books. I've gotten off my mind what I wanted to say today. I will be interviewing. I've had a couple of calls to some people I'm hoping to bring on the show. But meanwhile, check out my books. They're at Charles Moscowitz at Amazon Books. I've written several books on topics related to what I'm talking about today. I wrote a book called Islamo-Communism. I wrote a book called The War Against the Jews, which is not going away. It's forever, probably. All we can do as Jews is know our own hearts, become true to our own faith and our own identity, know God, know the moral and ethical precepts of the Torah, and strive to live by them. That's what we can do as Jews. We can't change other people, but if we do that, then we will be a strong people and a strong nation, and we will be able to fulfill our destiny as the chosen people by taking possession of that tiny, inscrutable little land that we now call the State of Israel, or Eretz Yisrael, and build a prosperous, moral, ethical state in that land to the best of our ability, our imperfect ability, and to take our place among the nations of the world, hopefully serving as a light unto the nations by example, especially the Arab nations. I think that's one of the reasons why the Arab nations have hated Israel so much. We threaten their power structure because we are a people who have created rights and sovereignty for our people in Israel. We have created a strong and prosperous and organic society that controls its own destiny, that is not ruled by elites and aristocrats and kings. Anyway, again, thank you for joining me, everyone. God bless you all. God bless America. And God bless the state of Israel. May the Lord God keep Israel and its people